So I spoke at the King's Speech debate on criminal justice, and just to explain how that works, after the King's Speech there are 6 days given over to reflect on the King's Speech, all of the different pieces of legislation, and they're organised in themes, and you're only allowed to choose one day. So I chose criminal justice and Home Office, and so I did my speech. It was actually an excellent day of debates. There was about 70 speakers, I think, and one of the things that was notable about it was that there was 2 new ministers, front bench ministers, who have been brought into the Lords to be ministers, and I disapprove of that on principle, from the point of view of saying if the Tories had done something similar, which they did with David Cameron, we'd all be tut-tutting. But there's 6 new ministers in the House of Lords, and if I was a Labour MP, I'd be rather insulted they felt they had to go outside in order to get the top jobs filled. But anyway, here we were with Lord Hanson of Flint. I say that because I made the point that Lord Hanson of Flint was significant for me because I went to school in Flint, so he had a little bit of a Flintshire loving. He even, and he discussed Flint in great detail in his speech. I quite like that. That's how superficial I am, by the way. I can easily bore. And the other person was Lord Timpson of Timpson Shops and prison rehabilitation fame, and they both spoke brilliantly. Timpson in particular was so smart about prison reform, and he, even in relation to the IPP prisoners scandal, which obviously I've been involved in, said, I know IPP prisoners, I've engaged with them. I mean, you don't hear that often from the dispatch box. So there was a sense in which I was very impressed. But a number of caveats that allow me to just say a few other things. I was very impressed, and yet there was something wrong with the way that every single person in the House of Lords yesterday said, Lord Timpson, how wonderful you are, what a brilliant person you are. I mean, by the time he'd finished, he was like a saint, right? And he hasn't done anything yet. And by the way, he spoke warmly of IPP prisoners and also said there was nothing they could do. So let's get our perspectives right here. It's also the case that there was this atmosphere of the grown-ups are back in charge, and I found it disconcerting that there was this assumption that these were sensible people who were very sensible about how they approach politics. They were restoring trust in politics, and that we could all calm down now, and there was nothing to fight over anymore. We're all going to work together, and I think that that is a myth. It's a cosy club. I have found, don't know about you, that when I've listened to Kamala Harris, I've thought, oh, she's quite good, really, isn't she? And then you remember, they're creating a kind of mythical world where, oh, sensible people sound sensible, not like mad Trump, or sensible people, not like the mad Tories all over the place, until you actually remember that the world that they're creating, in a kind of nice, warm, soft world with the House of Lords yesterday, everybody agreeing and so on, is fine if that was the world, but it bears no relationship to the real world at all, and in fact it demonises anyone who raises any difficult questions. In my speech, I didn't just talk about prison reform. I mentioned the conversion therapy bill, for example, which they kind of slightly jumped over in their responses. But more importantly, in a debate on law and order in this country, I was the only person who mentioned Hare Hill's riot, and the ministers didn't reply in relation to it. I also raised the issue of Islamicism in relation to the radical Islamists who were acting as bully boys who intimidated people during a general election that was only a couple of weeks ago. A massive thing happened in our democratic process, which was that people weren't able to canvass because they were so frightened and they were driven off the streets. And I raised that as a problem and said, you can't solve everything, through law. You have to have political leadership. Nobody came back on it. And so I think that I then realised, well, yes, there's a nice cosy consensus as long as you don't ruin the consensus by bringing in real world problems that are happening, and then they just ignore you or treat you with contempt. I thought that was particularly true of Lisa Nandy, who has told us that the culture wars are all over, we can all calm down, and that is fine. And as the head of the DCMS, I was thinking, how's she going to supervise culture and arts, which is being torn apart by identity politics and the culture wars, by just sort of wishing it away? Well, what's so ironic is that yesterday she actually proclaimed that trans women will be welcome in women's sports. But she's not interested in the culture wars because she's actually part of the culture wars. And in fact, she has just said something that is so toxic that even if she said it in a nice tone, it's actually divisive. And that's something about the tone. I've just been into the House of Lords now, where they're talking about standards in public life, and they're all saying, the tone is changing, everyone. The tone is changing. You can trust us. Yesterday, every time anyone mentioned, we will respect international law, they were almost getting standing ovation. We are not going to leave the EHRC. Standing ovation. We do not believe that the judiciary should be interfered in. Standing ovation, or the equivalent thereof. Actually, that's disastrous for democracy, because what they're saying is that we are going to allow these international courts or the judiciary to overrun democratic decision making. And so you can say things in a nice tone and be just as vicious, just as toxic, and in fact divisive as anyone else. So that's my sort of general assessment. A couple of small other things. There's a really weird atmosphere in the House of Lords because one of the groups that's being targeted by the King's Speech is the hereditary peers. And you might think it's a bit odd, but I'm actually very torn about hereditary peers. Not because I'm a great supporter of the hereditary peerage principle, or the bloodline, or all the rest of it, but because I can't stand the sanctimonious way that other members of the House of Lords talk about the hereditary peers as though they're the anti-democratic bit. Whereas actually we were all appointed rather than elected, so actually we're all there by some kind of fiat and grace of the great and the good. And I just don't like the easy pickings of having a go at the hereditary peers. But the hereditary peers themselves are in a state of some bitterness, let me tell you. And every time I bump into one or two of them, and there are some really good ones, I don't think I even knew they were hereditary until they now tell me that they won't be here for longer than a year. They want to rant at me about the bishops. There's a big turn against the bishops, because obviously, what are the bishops doing in the House of Lords? And they say, well, if they're getting rid of us, they should get rid of the bishops too. So when that bill comes up, which it will do in September, it's going to be vicious, I would have thought. And the final thing I wanted to say, and I know you've all been waiting for this, is the biggest question of the whole of my Inside the Lords, is the great reseat. Not reset, reseat. Where am I going to sit? I mentioned before that my original seat has now been kind of swamped by Tories because they've had to swap sides. And I was kind of sitting there on several occasions, squeezed in with Tories on all sides of me and Tories in front of me. And I have to say, I felt incredibly uncomfortable, not just physically, but just thought, I don't belong here. So I shuffled along the back bench behind the Tories and moved to sit next to Plaid Cymru, would you believe? The thing about Lord Wigley from Plaid Cymru is we don't agree on anything, but he's from North Wales, so going to be a bit regionally sectarian. He's also very nice. He's, in a way, independent, and he speaks his mind, and I kind of felt. So I'm next to Lord Wigley and Kate Hoey, and we kind of like are sitting together, which is sort of in between the Tories and the Lib Dems on the back seat, and it's utterly ridiculous. But to show you how funny the seating is, every day you watch Tories go in on the wrong side and then remember that they've been kicked out of government and walk back in, and vice versa. And today there was a very funny incident when Melvyn Bragg, Lord Bragg, realised after about a quarter of an hour that he was sitting with the Tories on the wrong side, in his usual seat but on the wrong side, and then got a giggling fit when he looked over and realised what had happened and had to retreat and go over to the Labour benches. So where you sit still really matters, but I think I'm now happy sort of between the Lib Dems and the Tories, but basically independent and next to a nice Welsh lord. I'll not report back next week because in fact we're going to be on recess until September the 1st, I think, September the 2nd. I will of course be in touch as the Academy of Ideas, but that's the last of Inside the Lords for the summer at least, and my speech that I gave on the King's Speech is below.